The Duke of Ashworth stood at the window of his Mayfair study, his back to the colossal walnut long-case clock that had not chimed in 7 years. Alexander Blackwood held his hands behind his back, knuckles white, as the last of London's celebrated clockmakers gathered his tools in defeated silence. Mr. Fenchurch, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in St. James's, shook his head. "I am deeply sorry, Your Grace. The escapement is like nothing I have encountered. The pinion leaves are worn to nothing, yet any attempt to replace them halts the music box entirely. It is as if the mechanism resents interference." Alexander did not turn. "You are the 11th man to tell me so. The 11th man who claimed mastery over every wheel and spring in Christendom." Fenchurch bowed himself out and the Duke exhaled, staring at the rain streaking the glass. The musical automaton in question, a gilded table clock depicting Diana the huntress drawing her bow while a hidden cylinder played a delicate air, had been a gift from his late mother. Its silence felt like a second morning. He would not let it pass into silence forever. The next morning, he instructed his secretary to search lower. Not Bond Street luminaries, not the Royal Society Fellows. Somewhere in the warren of Cheapside, where clever hands worked in obscurity, there must be someone who understood old French pin-barrel movements better than an Oxford lecturer. Word returned of a shop on Carter Lane. The sign faded nearly to illegibility. Thorne and daughter horologists. The Duke's mouth tightened. A daughter, a female winding cogs, was not what he had in mind, but desperation outweighed decorum. He arrived unannounced, his town coach drawing stairs among the carters and peamen. The shop interior was cramped and orderly, smelling of oil, brass polish, and dried lavender. Behind the counter, a young woman of perhaps 23 looked up. Her gown was gray serge, practical and untrimmed. Her hair, a shade between wheat and honey, was pulled back severely. Spectacles sat on a nose that was perfectly straight but unremarkable. Her mouth did not smile in welcome, it merely acknowledged a customer. "I require the finest clockmaker in London," the Duke said, his voice carrying the authority of 6 centuries. She wiped her hands on a cloth. "Then you have come to the wrong street, sir. The finest are all in Mayfair, and I hear they have failed you." He stiffened, so news had traveled. "And how would you know that, miss?" "Thorne, Eleanor Thorne." She lifted a tray of tiny screws and stepped out from behind the counter. "Your footman mentioned the automaton to our neighbor's boy. London hears everything, Your Grace." Her eyes, gray as the sky behind him, held no awe. "You may set the clock on the bench if you like." He found himself obeying. The case was unwrapped, revealing Diana's gilded form, her bow forever half-drawn. Eleanor studied it, not with reverence but with the sharp focus of a physician. She removed the back plate and bent over the movement, her fingers moving across the pinions without disturbing a single lever. She hummed a few bars of the missing melody under her breath. A Scottish air, he realized, one his mother had loved, and then reached for a fine steel hook. "The third wheel arbor has a hairline crack that shifts with temperature," she said without looking up. "Every time one of your masters adjusted the escapement, they tightened the bridge over a fracture that couldn't hold alignment. They were mending the symptom, not the wound." She asked for no assistance. He stood, immaterial, watching her hands work with a steadiness that seemed to make the clutter of the little shop fall away. In 40 minutes, the wheel was pinned, the bridge reset, and the music train wound. She touched the start lever. Diana drew her bow. The pinned cylinder revolved, and the first notes of the Flowers of Edinburgh fell into the dusty air. The Duke's throat closed. Eleanor Thorne closed the back plate and pushed the clock toward him. "1 hour. You will find it keeps true." He did not know how to thank her. Gratitude was a language he spoke poorly. Instead, he placed a heavy purse on the bench. She looked at the coins, then at him, and something in her expression was not cold but untouchable, as if she had already dismissed him from her thoughts. "I shall call again," he said, and the words felt clumsy. "If you wish." She picked up her cloth and returned to her work, leaving the Duke of Ashworth to find his own way out. All the way back to Mayfair, the melody haunted him, but it was not the music that kept him awake that night. It was the memory of gray eyes that had looked at a duke and seen only a clock to be mended. Part 2. 3 days later, Alexander Blackwood returned to Carter Lane. He told himself the visit was practical. A man who owned over 24 timepieces required a competent keeper, and London's finest had proven they were not competent. Miss Thorne's fee would be generous, her quarters decent but separate. It was a sound arrangement. Eleanor listened to his proposal from behind the counter, her spectacles catching the weak sun. She did not flutter at the offer of a position at Ashworth House. She asked precise questions about the collection: a Graham regulator, a French orrery clock, a Verge watch once owned by a Stuart king. Her knowledge was deep and unshowy, like a vein of silver running silent under common stone. She accepted because the shop's debts had teeth. Her father had been a brilliant man but a failing merchant. Since his passing, she had kept the creditors at bay by mending what others broke. A duke's wage would clear the ledgers within a year. She packed her tools into a canvas roll and took a hackney to Mayfair with the same composure another woman might carry to a ball. Her workroom at Ashworth House was a bright chamber on the ground floor, cold in the mornings but filled with fine brass and mahogany. She began by cataloging every piece, her notes meticulous. The servants watched her with suspicion. A woman who worked with her hands occupied an uneasy threshold, neither gentry nor true servant. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, was stiff but fair. The under-butler, a man named Creech, sneered behind her back and called her the cog girl. Eleanor ignored them. What mattered were the gears. The Duke saw her rarely in those first weeks, yet he was acutely aware of her presence. Passing her door, he would hear the soft click of a pallet or the distant ring of a bell being tested. Once, he entered unannounced and found her dismantling the orrery, her sleeves pushed up, a tiny brass earth in her palm. She did not jump or simper. She simply looked at him and waited, and he forgot why he had come. Then came the dinner. It was a small affair. A baron and his wife, a retired admiral, and Lord and Lady Bracknell. Lady Bracknell was a woman who sharpened her tongue on other women's shortcomings. When Alexander mentioned his restored automaton, she demanded to see it. He led the party to the drawing room, and Eleanor was asked to attend and demonstrate the mechanism. She entered quietly, her gray gown unchanged, her hair neat but unfashionable. Lady Bracknell raised her quizzing glass. "Good heavens, Ashworth, is this your celebrated horologist? She looks more like a governess who has lost her charge." The admiral chuckled. The baron's wife tittered behind her fan. Eleanor stood very still, her hands folded, her face a mask of patient stone. Alexander felt the insult land like a lash, but it was aimed at her, and his pride hesitated. Defend a servant publicly, and the tongue would whisper he was besotted. Say nothing, and she would understand it was merely politics. He said nothing. Eleanor demonstrated the automaton's music with perfect precision and answered technical questions in a clear, low voice. When Lady Bracknell asked if she had ever considered a more suitable occupation, perhaps plain sewing, Eleanor replied that sewing, like clockwork, required attention to hidden seams, and she trusted her skills were better placed where time itself was kept honest. The answer was a parry wrapped in velvet. The Duke saw Lady Bracknell's flush and felt a slow, confusing ache. Eleanor did not look at him as she left. She did not need to. Her silence was a verdict, and he stood convicted by his own cowardice. That night he could not sleep. The melody from Diana's clock played over and over in his mind, but it had become a lament. He had allowed a guest to belittle a woman whose genius lay literally in the palm of her hand, and he had let the slight pass because it was easier than appearing foolish before his peers. He rose and walked the dark corridors to the ground-floor workroom. A crack of light showed beneath the door. He pushed it open and found Eleanor at her bench, polishing a Verge watch with a chamois cloth. She did not startle. She simply looked up, her gray eyes unreadable. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace, I am staff." Her tone was clean, without self-pity. "You employ my hands, my feelings are not in the contract." He wanted to say that they were now, that they had crept in like damp through stone, but the words would not form. She turned back to her work, and he stood in the doorway like a supplicant, knowing that the distance between them had widened not because she had moved, but because he had failed to bridge it. Part 3. Lord Richard Ashby was everything the Duke was not. Easy in conversation, warm of manner, and possessed of a title he did not wield like a cudgel. He arrived at Ashworth House for a fortnight's stay, and within a day had found his way to the ground-floor workroom. Eleanor was mending a mantel clock that chimed the hours in maritime bells, and Richard, a naval man in his youth, was captivated. He did not speak to her as a curiosity. He asked her opinions, listened while she explained the equation of time, and laughed without mockery when she admitted she had once built a clock with a swallow's escapement from a sketch in her father's journal. He visited daily, bringing tea she did not touch and questions she answered with increasing ease. The Duke noticed. He noticed the way Richard's voice softened in her presence, the way Eleanor's shoulders lost their guarded set when she spoke to him. Jealousy crept into Alexander's chest like smoke, silent and suffocating. He began to find excuses to interrupt, a question about a bracket clock, an inquiry about the orrery's progress. Eleanor answered him with her usual competence and her usual distance, but when Richard spoke, her eyes flickered with something brighter. A week later, a scandal sheet called the Tatler printed a blind item about a nobleman who kept a mysterious female mechanic in his home, hinting at late hours and closed doors. No names were used, but the allusions were sharp enough to draw blood. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth descended upon the townhouse within the hour. She was a woman carved from marble and grievance. She found Eleanor in the workroom and dismissed her with a lift of her chin, as if clearing a tray of spent tea leaves. That evening, Eleanor lingered in the corridor outside the Duke's study, intending to deliver a list of required materials. The door was ajar. She heard the Dowager's voice, cut glass and unyielding. "Alexander, you must send the thorn creature away. The talk is becoming unendurable. People are saying she has designs upon you." The Duke's reply came tired and low. "She has no designs, mother. She is merely a useful employee. Her skill with the collection is exceptional, but that is the extent of my interest. There is nothing improper." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the list. Merely a useful employee. The phrase was a small, clean knife. She had never harbored illusions of romance. She was a tradeswoman with spectacles and ink-stained cuffs. But to hear herself reduced to a piece of household machinery, as replaceable as a scullery maid, stripped something raw inside her. She did not confront him. She turned and walked back to her workroom, laid the list on her bench, and sat in the dark. The Verge watch Richard had admired ticked on the shelf, its heartbeat indifferent. She had allowed herself, in some unguarded corner of her mind, to imagine that the Duke saw her as more than a tool. The Dowager's words had pried that hope open, but the Duke's own voice had crushed it. The next morning she performed her duties with her usual precision. When Richard came to bid her good day, she smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. He noticed. He did not press. He simply sat beside her and handed her a tiny brass pinion he had found in a curiosity shop, saying it reminded him of the mechanism she had described. The Duke saw them together through the half-open door. The jealousy that had been smoke now blazed into flame. He entered and dismissed Richard with a curtness that bordered on rudeness. When they were alone, he turned to Eleanor, his composure fraying. "You encourage Ashby's attentions," he said. Eleanor set down her tweezers. "Lord Ashby treats me as a person of mind. I find no fault in that. He is heir to a marquis. Do you imagine his family would welcome a match with a woman who oils cogs for wages?" The question was cruel, and he knew it. Eleanor stood, her posture a column of quiet dignity. I imagine nothing, Your Grace. I have been schooled by your household in what I am permitted to expect. A useful employee, you said. An exceptional pair of hands. Is that not correct? His face went white. She had overheard. There was no defense, only the terrible silence of a man who had been exposed in his cowardice and could not find his way back to honor. Elinor picked up her canvas tool roll and walked past him. She did not slam the door. She closed it with the soft click of a latch, the sound more final than any shout. Part 4. Elinor did not leave Ashworth House that night. She had agreed to restore the St. Albans astronomical clock, a legendary piece that tracked the phases of the moon, the positions of the planets, and the equation of sunrise across 5 counties. The exhibition was a week away, and she would not abandon a work that bore her father's secret improvements. She owed the machine her completion, not the Duke her presence. She labored in silence, sleeping in snatches, eating what Mrs. Farrow left on a tray. Richard Ashby attempted to visit, but she sent word that she could not be disturbed. The Duke left letters under her door, folded squares of paper she did not open. She had learned the cost of misplaced hope, and she would not pay it twice. The night of the exhibition arrived. The Ashworth ballroom glittered with crystal and candlelight. The St. Albans clock stood on a dais, its celestial dome rotating in silent majesty. Guests circled it, murmuring admiration. The Duke, dressed in black velvet, delivered a speech acknowledging the restoration. Then he spoke words no one expected. The genius behind this clock is not mine. It belongs to Miss Elinor Thorne, a master horologist whose skill surpasses any I have known in this city. A rustle swept the room. Lady Bracknell's quizzing glass rose. The Dowager's fan stopped mid-flutter. Elinor, standing at the edge of the crowd in her gray gown, felt the weight of 100 stares. Some were curious, some pitying, some openly scornful. A young viscountess whispered loudly, "Is that the plain clockmaker? How droll!" Then Richard Ashby stepped forward. He took Elinor's hand and bowed over it, his manner deliberate and public. "Miss Thorne, your work is a marvel. London has been blind, but blindness is curable." He spoke loudly enough that Lady Bracknell heard every syllable. Several guests tittered. The Duke's jaw tightened. After the exhibition, Alexander found Elinor in the corridor that led to the servants' stair. His expression was thunderous. "Ashby made a spectacle of himself and of you. You allowed it." Elinor met his gaze. "He offered respect in a room full of people who offered me contempt. I will not apologize for accepting it." "You belong here in this house, not on his arm." "Belong?" Her voice was soft and devastating. "I belong nowhere. That I am valued only when convenient. You called me useful, Your Grace. A tool does not belong, it is kept. I will not be kept." She drew a folded paper from her sleeve, her resignation, written in the same steady hand that had repaired his heirloom. She pressed it into his palm. He looked down at the paper, then at her face, and saw the resolution there. She had not raged. She had not wept. She had simply withdrawn as the tide withdraws from a shore, and he was left clutching sand. He did not call after her. His pride was a wall too high to scale in a single moment. Elinor walked through the empty kitchens, past the starring servants, and out into the London night. The air was cool and smelled of coal smoke. She had no carriage, no escort. She walked the 3 miles to Carter Lane, her tool roll under her arm, her heart a small, heavy clock that had not stopped but only rewound itself to beat alone. The shop was dark and dusty. She lit a single lamp and sat down at the bench where her father had taught her to file a pinyon leaf. The silence of the space was not loneliness, it was peace. She had her craft. She had her name. She did not need a duke's protection or a lord's compliments to make her whole. In Mayfair, Alexander Blackwood stood in the empty ballroom, the astronomical clock still tracing its silent paths overhead. He opened the paper she had given him. The lettering was precise, each stroke formed with the same care she gave a wheel tooth. She did not ask for anything. She did not accuse. She simply stated her departure and wished him well. That restraint was more damning than any accusation. He had lost something irreplaceable, and he had known it only when it was gone. The clock above him marked the hour, its chime clear and true, the sound of her work outlasting him. Part 5. Carter Lane returned to Alina like a well-worn coat. She opened the shop each morning, brewed her own tea, and mended the clocks of merchants, sea captains, and widows who could pay little but brought her cuttings from their gardens. The weight of Ashworth House lifted slowly, though a residue of sadness clung to the stillness between chimes. Lord Richard Ashby called on the third day. He did not arrive in a crested carriage but on foot, his collar turned against the drizzle. He sat in the shop's single customer chair and spoke not of courtship but of an investment. He wished to fund a proper workshop, a place where her genius could train apprentices. He asked nothing in return except the satisfaction of backing genuine skill. "You are offering me charity dressed as business," Alina said, not unkindly. "I am offering you capital dressed as respect," he replied. "Take it or refuse it, I shall still come for tea." She studied him. His brown eyes held no hidden hooks. He admired her, perhaps even loved her, but he did not press. He was content to wait, and that patience was a gift she could not yet return. She accepted the tea but deferred the investment. The Duke came next. He arrived in plain clothes, a heavy coat, a hat pulled low, and stood on the threshold like a man entering a church. Alina was behind the counter, filing a replacement detent for a bracket clock. She looked up, and for a long moment neither spoke. "I read your letter," he said. "The ones I pushed under your door, you never opened them." "I was not ready to open them." He nodded. His face was thinner, the arrogance worn down to something rawer. "Will you let me explain?" "Explanations are for those who wish to be excused. I do not require your excuses, your grace." She resumed her filing. "If you have a clock to mend, I will mend it. Otherwise, I am occupied." He left, but he returned the following day with a carriage clock that required no repair. She inspected it, found nothing amiss, and told him so. He thanked her and left again. On the third day he brought bread from a bakery she favored. How he knew, she could not guess, and set it on the counter without a word. This ritual continued for a fortnight. He did not plead. He did not demand. He simply appeared, sometimes helping an elderly customer carry a heavy clock, sometimes sweeping the doorstep of wet leaves. Creech, the under-butler, was seen delivering a crate of brass stock with a subdued expression, a sign that the Duke's household had undergone some stern reordering. The ton gossiped ferociously. The Duke of Ashworth, they said, had lost his senses. He was courting a tradeswoman, a female who wore spectacles and grease-stained cuffs. The dowager took to her bed with palpitations. Lady Bracknell composed a limerick that circulated at 3 separate routes. Alina paid the talk no mind. What troubled her was not society's scorn, but a discovery she made in the quiet of a rainy afternoon. She had kept the Duke's automaton in her memory, but she had never examined its case fully. A visiting French clockmaker asked to see the famous Diana clock, and the Duke reluctantly brought it to her shop. After the Frenchman departed, Alina sat alone with the piece, running her fingers over the gilded base. A seam in the wood felt wrong, too regular. She pressed a hidden catch, and a narrow drawer slid open beneath the clock's belly. Inside lay a folded letter, yellowed but intact. The script was her father's. The date was 40 years past. Her hands did not shake. She spread the letter on the bench and read the account of how the late Duke of Ashworth, Alexander's father, had purchased an extraordinary clock designed from her grandfather, commissioned the piece, then claimed the invention as his own. Her grandfather had been paid a pittance and sworn to secrecy, his reputation smothered so the Duke could pose as a patron of the arts. The family had slid into obscurity not through failure of talent but through deliberate theft. Alina folded the letter and sat in the gathering dusk. The heirloom she had repaired was the very instrument of her family's ruin. The irony was not lost on her. She did not weep. She did not rage. She lit a candle and waited because the Duke would come again, and when he did, she would have something to say that no clock could speak. Part 6. He came the next morning. The spring sun caught the brass fittings in the shop window, and Alina was standing behind the counter with the letter in her apron pocket. She motioned him to the chair and told him she had found something he must read. Alexander sat. She placed the letter before him. He recognized the hand, not Alina's father, but his own father's, a sprawling penmanship he knew from estate ledgers. He read in silence. The blood drained from his face in stages, first disbelief, then a sick recognition, and finally a shame so profound his hands began to tremble. "This cannot be," he whispered. "It can. Your father stole a design, silenced my grandfather, and let my family fall. The clock you treasure was built on a lie." He looked up, and Alina saw the fracture in him. The arrogance she had once resented was gone, replaced by a hollow grief. "I did not know. I swear I did not know." "I believe you." Her voice was steady, but not ungentle. "But ignorance does not undo the harm. My father died in this shop, scraping for commissions while your family's name was polished with my grandfather's genius. I will not carry this secret to protect you." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "What do you want? Name it. I will give you anything." "I do not want payment. I want the truth spoken aloud, in the same rooms where my grandfather was erased. I want the ton to hear from your lips that the Ashworth automaton was created by Josiah Thorne, and that his descendants were wronged." The demand was immense. A public confession would humiliate the dukedom, tarnish his father's memory, and invite ridicule and social exile. He would be the duke who unmade his own legacy. He looked at Alina, her plain gray dress, her spectacles, her unyielding dignity, and he understood that she was not punishing him. She was offering him a chance to be the man he had claimed he was. "I will do it," he said. "At the Granville Ball, the entire peerage will be present." She nodded. "Then I will be there, not as your employee, not as your guest, but as Josiah Thorne's granddaughter. And when you have finished, I will decide whether your apology is enough." The days before the ball were taut. Richard Ashby came to call and heard the whole account. His face was grave, but he did not dissuade her. "You are the braver person in this room," he said, and kissed her hand with a finality that was also a farewell. He knew, perhaps before she did, that her heart had already chosen a more difficult road. The Granville Ball was the jewel of the late season. Crystal chandeliers, a sea of silks and diamonds, the air thick with perfume and calculation. Alina entered on the Duke's arm, wearing a gown of deep blue, a color that did not shout but did not hide. Her spectacles were polished. Her hair was dressed simply, and the ton stared with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. Alexander escorted her to the center of the room and raised his hand. The music faltered. The conversations ebbed. He spoke in a clear, carrying voice, outlining the history of the automaton, his father's deception, and the theft of Josiah Thorne's design. He named the wrong and claimed it as his family's burden. He ended by publicly restoring the Thorne name and announcing a fund to establish a horological academy in Josiah's honor. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, like a crack spreading across ice, whispers broke out. Lady Bracknell looked as if she had swallowed a wasp. The Dowager Duchess, seated on a gilt chair, went pale and rigid. But here and there, faces showed not scorn but respect for the truth, and for the man who had been strong enough to speak it. Then Alexander turned to Alina. His voice dropped, but the hush carried it to every corner. "I have another confession. I love this woman. I love her mind, her hands, her courage. And I am asking her before all of you if she will do me the honor of becoming my wife." The room gasped. A duke proposing to a clockmaker's daughter publicly, while still wearing the dust of his own scandal. It was the stuff of legend or ruin. Alina stepped forward. She did not weep. She did not swoon. She looked into his eyes and saw the man who had failed, stumbled, and risen. She saw not perfection but intention, and intention she had learned. was what kept any mechanism running long after the winding key was removed. "I will," she said, her voice carrying like a bell note. "Not because you have saved me, but because you have seen me. And a woman who is truly seen can build her own legacy alongside any man." He took her hand. The band struck up a waltz, and in the corner of the ballroom, the musical automaton he had brought with him, Diana the Huntress, her bow now fully drawn, began to play the Flowers of Edinburgh, its melody rising above the scandal and the triumph alike. Part 7. The marriage of Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, and Eleanor Thorne was held not at St. George's but at a small stone church in Cheapside, with the Clockmakers' Guild lining the steps. The Ton called it a mad spectacle. The merchants called it justice. The couple called it Tuesday, and afterward they walked to Carter Lane, where a newly polished sign read Thorne and Ashworth, horologists to the crown. The academy was founded within a year, housed in a converted warehouse near the river. Eleanor designed the curriculum herself, blending mechanics, mathematics, and the art of patience. Apprentices came from the foundling hospitals, the workhouses, and the drawing rooms of curious young ladies who had been told clocks were not for them. The Duke funded it all and never once asked for credit. He did, however, learn to file a pinion leaf. He was clumsy at first, his hands too large and his temper too quick. Eleanor taught him with the same steadiness she brought to every broken thing, and in time he could true a wheel almost as well as she could. They worked side by side in the old shop, the Duke's coat off and his cuffs rolled, while London's finest came to gape and left with their watches running better than they had in decades. The Dowager Duchess eventually visited. She stood in the workshop, watching her son oil a verge escapement, and declared that the world had gone entirely upside down. Then she saw the letters from the Prince Regent's household, commissioning a clock for the pavilion, and her protests grew quieter. She never fully approved, but she did send a hamper at Christmas, which Eleanor accepted with the same grace she offered everything else. Lord Richard Ashby married a naval captain's daughter and became a patron of the Academy, his friendship steady and undemanding. Lady Bracknell's limerick was forgotten. The Tatler tried to revive the scandal but found little appetite for it. Truth, it seemed, had a staying power that gossip lacked. On the 5th anniversary of the Granville Ball, Eleanor stood in the Academy's great hall, watching a dozen young women bend over their benches. The central clock, a masterpiece of her own design, chimed the hour. Its mechanism incorporated a tiny silver swallow that flew from an opening door, a nod to the first clock she had ever invented. Alexander came to stand beside her. He wore no coat, his waistcoat dusted with brass filings. "You have built more than a clock," he said. "We built it," she corrected, her hand finding his. "We mended what was broken and made it keep time for those who come after. That is all any of us can do." He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, still marked with the faint lines of her labor. She smiled, not because her life had become a fairy tale, but because it had become her own. The girl who had been plain, overlooked, and useful had never needed to become beautiful or grand. She had needed only to be seen, and in being seen to see others. Outside, London clattered and chimed, its 1,000 church bells marking the hour. Inside, the Swallow clock trilled, and Eleanor Thorne, now a duchess, always a clockmaker, turned back to her bench, where the next broken thing waited to be restored.